The 23rd of January 1943. Over the green-grey waters east of Bougainville, Lieutenant Saburo Hattori of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 204th Air Group leaned his A6M30 into a shallow dive and frowned. Below, two unfamiliar shapes climbed sluggishly toward his formation, twin tails glinting in the morning light, long wings broad as torpedo bomber spans, noses like blunt spears. He had never seen such fighters. Through his headset, laughter crackled over the intercom. America no renga buta, America's flying brick. To the Japanese pilots of Rabaul, steeped in years of light, agile combat doctrine, the new American twin-engine aircraft looked ridiculous. Fighters, by every law of aerial grace, were supposed to be slender, reactive, and single-engined extensions of their pilots' arms. The P-38 Lightning seemed an engineering joke, heavy, awkward, all machine, and no spirit. Hattori's commander, Lieutenant Sekimdar, Ichiro Iwata, reportedly remarked after his first sighting, "It climbs like a whale and turns like a mountain. We need not fear such machines." What neither man realized was that the flying brick had been built for a kind of war the Japanese had never imagined, a war of physics, horsepower, and altitude. When the 339th Fighter Squadron arrived on Guadalcanal in early 1943, its pilots were scarcely more comfortable with the Lockheed P-38 than their enemies were. The twin-engined fighter, powered by a pair of Allison Von 1000, 710 seconds each, driving a 13-foot propeller, was unlike anything else in the air. The turbo-superchargers buried in the twin booms gave it performance above 20,000 feet that no other Allied fighter in the Pacific could match, but the system's complexity terrified new pilots. Intercooler flaps, manifold pressure gauges, and turbine inlet temperature dials demanded constant attention. Captain John H. Mitchell, later of Operation Vengeance fame, recalled, "You didn't fly a Lightning casually. It was like managing two engines, a chemistry lab, and a bomb all at once." The ground crews, many barely out of trade school, learned to tune the Allisons by feel and by the color of exhaust smoke. The squadron's first few weeks on the island were filled with accidents, overboosted engines, torque roll takeoffs, nose-wheel collapses on coral runways. The joke that the P-38 killed more Americans in training than Japanese in combat had a grim edge of truth. Still, when the 339th finally began flying combat patrols up the slot, the narrow seaway separating Guadalcanal from the northern islands of New Georgia and Bougainville, the pilots discovered that beneath the Lightning's bulk lay breathtaking speed and resilience. Cruising at 300 miles per hour, its twin engines barely humming at 35 inches of manifold pressure, it could cover twice the range of a P-40. With external tanks, it could patrol as far north as the Japanese base at Rabaul, the hub of Imperial air power in the South Pacific. The Japanese, by contrast, fought within the limits of their older, lighter machines. The Mitsubishi A6M30 was still a masterpiece of agility, but it was optimized for short-range engagements. Its thin skin and unarmored tanks made it vulnerable to even a few 50 caliber hits. The Nakajima Ki 43 Hayabusa, the Army's equivalent, was lighter still, but underpowered above 20,000 feet. Against these opponents, the P-38 seemed alien, even wrong. Its wide twin tails, its thick wings, and its huge propeller arcs looked like over-engineering from a culture obsessed with machines rather than men. The pilots of the Japanese 4th Air Group, based at Rabaul, mocked the Lightning in their daily operations diary. The 3rd of February 1943 entry described an interception north of New Georgia. Two heavy enemy fighters seen, resembling twin-tailed bombers. They turn poorly. Not dangerous if engaged swiftly. Another entry 2 weeks later carried more humor than analysis. Enemy flying bricks cannot dance. When we circle, they fall behind like old women. Yet by mid-March, a subtle shift crept into the same diary. An addendum written in the cramped hand of a senior petty officer noted, "One enemy twin-engine fighter observed trailing smoke but continued climbing north. Hit many times, does not fall." In a world where a single cannon shell could dismember a Zero, this defiance of physics unsettled men, trained to trust instinct over mathematics. The brick's durability was not luck. The P-38's tricycle landing gear gave it a deep armored nose section ideal for housing its concentrated weapon battery. 4. 50 caliber Browning machine guns and one 20mm Hispano cannon, all aligned along the center line. This meant no convergence problems, no bullet spread calibrated to a guessed distance. A Lightning's pilot simply aimed and fired. The results were clinical. The same forward mass that dulled its turning speed also absorbed punishment. With self-sealing tanks, armored cockpit glass, and redundant hydraulic lines, the P-38 could take damage that would vaporize lighter fighters. In February 1943, during a sortie over Kolombangara, Lieutenant J. Robbins took cannon hits in both engines from a Zero that caught him in a climbing turn. One propeller feathered automatically, the other coughed blue smoke. He still managed to limp 200 miles back to Guadalcanal on a single engine. Mechanics found more than 100 bullet holes in the aircraft. Robbins called it a flying fortress with 2 seats missing. The Japanese learned this the hard way. Gun camera footage preserved in 13 Fighter Command's debriefing archives shows one of the earliest P-38 kills in the South Pacific, a Zero dissolving under a point-blank burst of 50 caliber fire. The film lasts less than 4 seconds. When shown at mission briefings, it silenced laughter more effectively than any lecture. But victory was hardly routine. Early in 1943, the Americans still fought a war of attrition in which every sortie was a gamble against weather, fatigue, and experience. The pilots of the 339th were often outnumbered and still learning the Pacific's strange meteorology, how squalls could erase visibility in seconds, how sun glare could blind a man during a diving attack. Japanese flyers, veterans of China and Malaya, exploited every weakness. They would feint high, force a P-38 into a climbing turn, and then roll inverted to snap back beneath it. More than one Lightning vanished that way, falling through cloud layers into the sea. Each loss produced a torrent of analysis. 13 Fighter Command circulated mimeographed lessons from combat sheets that read like engineering manuals disguised as sermons. Do not attempt to turn with the enemy. Convert speed into altitude and engage from above. Keep turbo RPM under control during low-altitude flight to avoid overboost. Slowly, the squadron began to think not like duelists but like technicians. The payoff came in March. On the 22nd, a formation of 6 P-38 seconds intercepted a flight of 6 Betty bombers escorted by Zeros over the northern Solomons. Diving from 18,000 feet, the Lightning struck so quickly that the Japanese didn't register their approach until tracers were already cutting through the bomber formation. 2 Bettys exploded in mid-air. Another plunged into the sea, trailing fuel. The Zeros tried to chase the attackers upward and failed, their engines wheezing in thin air, while the Allison's turbo-superchargers kept roaring. When the surviving Americans returned to Guadalcanal, they had learned the equation that would define their war. Altitude plus speed equaled survival. By the end of March, the tone in Japanese communications had changed. The 4th Air Group diary for the 29th recorded tersely, "Enemy twin-engine fighters now appear from above, very fast. Attacks impossible to avoid. New tactics required." The laughter had stopped. Still, the nickname lingered in pilots' messes. Renga Buta the brick. They used it with unease now, as though saying the word could restore the hierarchy the sky had taken away. Because every time those twin tails appeared out of the sun, climbing through the thin air above Rabaul's volcanic crown, the Japanese pilots faced an impossible contradiction. The thing they had mocked for its bulk and clumsiness was suddenly higher, faster, and untouchable, a flying brick that had learned how to climb. And in its cockpit sat Americans who, after months of failure and loss, were finally beginning to understand their own machine. They didn't have the instinctive grace of Zero pilots. They had something more methodical, more relentless, the mathematics of altitude, horsepower, and return. Over the Bismarck Sea, that mathematics was about to change the war. The first rule of flying the Lightning was simple: never fight a zero on its own terms. The second rule, taught the hard way over the Solomon Islands, was that altitude was life. The P-38's appearance over the South Pacific had rewritten the geometry of combat. Its pilots no longer thought in circles, as dogfighters once did. They thought in slopes and gradients, angles of climb, rates of turn, dive recovery speeds. Everything about the airplane, from its wide wings to its twin Allison V-1000, 710 engines, was built for the vertical fight. If you understood that math, you lived. The Japanese knew how to turn. The Zero's massive ailerons and light structure let it pivot like a dragonfly. Its pilots measured victory in degrees per second of roll rate. The Lightning pilots learned to measure theirs in feet per minute. The Allisons, each fed by General Electric turbo-superchargers, could sustain 1,475 horsepower apiece up to 25,000 feet, an unthinkable figure for any single-engine Japanese fighter. Every turn of the turbine reclaimed power the air had stolen. To the men of the 339th, the whistle of those turbos on climb-out became the sound of survival. Lockheed's test reports at Burbank had already proven the numbers. In clean condition, the Lightning climbed at nearly 3,200 feet per minute at combat power, faster than anything in the Pacific except perhaps the rare Ki-61 Hien, which the Americans hadn't yet met. But these were laboratory statistics. Over Guadalcanal, they became acts of faith. Pilots calculated fuel burn to the gallon, knowing a full power climb could drain their tanks before reaching cruising altitude. Those who misjudged found themselves gliding home in silence, praying the twin booms would hold together on a dead-stick landing. Captain Tom Lanphier called the Lightning a mathematician's airplane. Everything about it demanded numbers: manifold pressure, RPM, fuel pressure, intercooler flaps, mixture control. Even the guns, the famous cluster of 4, 50 calibers and one 20mm cannon, were tools of arithmetic. While Zero pilots still adjusted their wing guns to converge at a guessed 200 meters, the Lightning fired a perfectly parallel stream, its bullets converging forever. A Japanese fighter crossing that stream could be torn open from spinner to tail in one pass. The P-38's weight, once mocked by both friend and foe, became a hidden advantage. In a dive, it carried more momentum than the lighter Japanese planes could follow. When a Lightning rolled inverted and pointed earthward, its sheer mass pulled it like a hammer dropped from heaven. Japanese pilots learned to fear that hammer. One Zero ace, Lieutenant Toshio Ota, wrote after the war that the twin-tailed fighter would dive so steeply that even if we followed, our wings began to shake and the controls froze. Then it would pull up, climbing again faster than we could hope to. But this power came with traps. At speeds above 420 miles per hour, compressibility locked the P-38's elevators solid. Early pilots discovered this too late, diving themselves into the sea. It took Lockheed engineers months and revised training manuals to teach them how to recover, reduce power, roll inverted, and ease out gently below 10,000 feet. To the engineers at Burbank, it was a physics problem. To the men at Guadalcanal, it was a lesson paid for with funerals. By March 1943, the survivors had mastered the formula. The P-38's climb was not just a maneuver, it was a weapon. The technique became doctrine. Start high, attack fast, dive through the enemy formation, then convert speed into altitude again before the enemy could turn. The Japanese called it the lightning strike. American instructors simply called it boom and zoom. The 339th's daily mission reports reveal how fast the learning spread. Over the slot, pilots who had once tried to dogfight now used altitude like ammunition. Attack from sun at 25,000 feet, one pilot scribbled in his debrief log. Enemy rolled to evade. I climbed vertically, looped over, and fired in head-on pass. The results were devastating. The Lightning's heavy nose battery shattered Zeros before they could tighten their turns. Even the skeptics at X-13 fighter command officers, who had favored the P-40 for its toughness, began to concede. The Lightning's combination of climb, range, and hitting power made it uniquely suited for the vast distances of the South Pacific. With twin drop tanks, It could escort bombers all the way to Bougainville and back, a 1,000-mile circuit unthinkable for single-engine fighters. To the Japanese, the shift felt like witchcraft. Reports reaching Rabaul in late March spoke of enemy twin-engined fighters appearing suddenly from above. The 4th Air Group's diary that month carried a short, grim note. Their climb superior to ours. We must avoid vertical battle. From the ground, American maintenance crews saw the same truth in a different language fuel charts, spark plug temperatures, and boost gauges. Every turbo-supercharger adjusted correctly meant another fighter that could climb out of reach. The drop tank that arrived by Liberty ship meant one more mile of surprise. Industrial arithmetic was rewriting air combat. When the 339th pilots briefed their missions, they stopped speaking of luck or courage. They talked about angles, energy, and time to climb. Over the Solomons, war had become a kind of engineering one, where equations, not instincts, decided who lived. In the months ahead, that engineering would culminate in one of the most precise ambushes in aviation history. A mission drawn entirely on a map, flown at wave-top height for hundreds of miles, and resolved in a climb so exact it left the enemy no chance. The Japanese would call it fate. The Americans would call it Operation Vengeance. On the morning of the 13th of April 1943, the cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor intercepted what looked like just another operational dispatch from Rabaul. The coded message, transmitted by the Imperial Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet, contained flight plans, coordinates, and times routine chatter in JN-25B, the latest cipher system. But when linguists decrypted it later that day, the text froze the room. It was an inspection itinerary, complete to the minute, for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the mind behind Pearl Harbor, was planning an aerial tour of forward bases in the northern Solomons. His aircraft, a G-4M Betty bomber, would depart Rabaul at 0600 on April 18, stop at Balale, Bouin, and Shortland, and return by midday. The Americans now possessed what every intelligence officer dreams of, and few ever see: the precise schedule of an enemy's most important leader. The information raced across secure channels to Admiral Chester Nimitz, then to Admiral William Bull Halsey at South Pacific Command. Halsey, who had lost friends at Pearl Harbor, didn't hesitate. "Tally ho Yamamoto," he scrawled on the margin of the decrypt, approving an operation so audacious it bordered on impossible. The plan would be simple in principle, exquisite in execution. Intercept Yamamoto's bomber over Bougainville and shoot it down. To do it, the Americans needed range, and only one fighter in the Pacific could reach that far: the P-38 Lightning. The twin-engine aircraft that Japanese pilots had dismissed as a flying brick was suddenly the only tool with the legs and the climb to pull off an ambush nearly 600 miles from Guadalcanal. At Kukum Field, Major John W. Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron was called to brief 13 Fighter Command. Intelligence officers spread charts across a wooden table, tracing Yamamoto's intended course with a ruler. They calculated the intercept point, a spot near the southwest coast of Bougainville, just inland from Empress Augusta Bay. The coordinates had to be exact within minutes. A deviation of even 10 miles would doom the mission. The numbers looked grim. The distance from Guadalcanal to the intercept point was 435 miles one way. The P-38 seconds would have to fly at wave-top height to avoid Japanese radar and visual detection, burning fuel all the while, then climb sharply to interception altitude at the last possible moment. The round trip, including the climb, would push the Lightning's range limits to the edge of physics. Mitchell and his operations officer spent the night doing fuel arithmetic with pencils worn to stubs. Each P-38 would carry two 165-gallon drop tanks in addition to internal fuel. That gave them roughly 2,300 total horsepower to lift 3,000 pounds of gas, guns, and ammunition into the air. The engines would have to be leaned to perfection, no wasted throttle, no unnecessary climb. Even the start sequence was rehearsed to save seconds. Mitchell handpicked 18 P-38Gs for the mission. The plan divided them into two groups. 4 killers, who would attack the target directly, and 14 top-cover aircraft to fend off escorting Zeros. Captain Thomas G. Lanfier Jr., Lieutenant Rex T. Barber, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine would form the killer section. Each studied maps until the times were etched into memory. At 0700 Guadalcanal time on April 18, they would take off, fly a precise 310-degree bearing for 600 miles at an altitude of only 50 feet and arrive at the intercept point at exactly 0934. It was navigation by stopwatch and sun, guided by dead reckoning alone. Radio silence was absolute. One stray transmission could betray the mission to Rabaul's listening posts. Every calculation hinged on one final factor, the Lightning's climb. The intercept required the P-38 seconds to be at 18,000 feet when Yamamoto's G4Ms appeared. That meant they had to begin climbing at a precise distance from the target too soon, and they'd be seen, too late, and they'd arrive too low. Mitchell marked the climb point on his map with a sharp pencil line. "Gentlemen," he said at the briefing, "if we hit this spot on time and climb clean, we'll meet him right over that point of land. 1 minute early or late, and we miss him." The pilots nodded silently. The room smelled of sweat and aviation fuel. They all understood what the mission meant. Yamamoto's death would be more than revenge. It would be a psychological strike against the myth of Japanese invincibility. But they also knew what a single navigation error could mean. 18 aircraft lost in the ocean with no hope of rescue. Across the sea at Rabaul, Yamamoto's staff prepared with military precision. The Admiral's punctuality was legendary. He was said to arrive within 60 seconds of any scheduled time. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers were readied for the flight, each polished and refueled overnight. The first, with tail number T on a -323, would carry Yamamoto and his senior staff. The second, T on a -326, would carry his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki. Their escort would be 6A-6M0 fighters from the 204th Air Group, among the best pilots in the Solomons. The Japanese considered the trip low risk. The Americans, they believed, had neither the range nor the precision to challenge an overwater flight of this distance. Rabaul's intelligence summaries dismissed any possibility of interception. "Enemy fighters limited to southern Solomons," one staff note read. "No threat north of New Georgia. The trap was already closing." On April 17, the night before takeoff, mechanics at Guadalcanal worked under blackout conditions, topping off fuel and checking oxygen bottles. Pilots lay in tents, unable to sleep, listening to rain beat against canvas. They were not told the target by name, only that it was a very important Japanese officer. But word travelled fast in fighter circles. By midnight, everyone knew. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor was coming, and they would be waiting. Outside the briefing hut, the dark Pacific stretched toward Bougainville, hundreds of miles of open water that could swallow any mistake. The mission depended on one thing above all, the P-38's ability to climb on cue. When the moment came, those flying bricks would have to turn their weight into altitude, their engines into time. Somewhere in that climb lay the most important 30 seconds of the Pacific Air War. Dawn broke over Guadalcanal with the roar of 18 Allison engines. At 0700, the 18th of April 1943, the P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron rolled down Kukum Field's pierced steel runway and lifted into the humid Pacific air. Each machine was heavy with fuel, over 3,000 pounds of aviation gas, sloshing in internal tanks, and twin 165-gallon drop tanks bolted beneath the wings. The sun was still low, gilding the jungle and the wreckage of old air battles. From the ground, the formation looked like silver arrows skimming the sea. The pilots throttled back, keeping altitude below 50 feet so low that propeller wash tore white scars in the ocean's surface. The only sound inside the cockpits was the synchronized howl of the Allisons and the faint metallic hiss of turbo-superchargers breathing salt air. Major John Mitchell led the way, glancing at his wristwatch. Time was everything now. The intercept depended on math, not instinct. They had to fly 435 miles at exactly 200 knots, hit the climb point to the second, and reach 18,000 feet at precisely 0934 hours. Any deviation 10 seconds 10 degrees would mean missing their target entirely. Over the Solomon Sea, the mission became a lesson in endurance. Each pilot leaned his mixture until the Allisons just purred above detonation. The air smelled faintly of hot oil and sweat. The ocean stretched unbroken in every direction, the color of molten steel. After 2 hours, the men began to understand how far from home they were. If one engine failed, there would be no rescue, just an endless expanse of water. To conserve radio silence, Mitchell signaled changes of course with shallow banking motions. The formation adjusted automatically, 18 aircraft moving as one. At 0900, they crossed Bougainville's southern coast. Ahead lay the dark green spine of jungle ridges and, beyond that, Yamamoto's flight path. At 0910, Mitchell checked his chart. They were 5 minutes early. He held the course a few more miles, then pointed his gloved hand forward the signal. The climb began. The Lightnings surged skyward, turbochargers whistling like kettles under strain. The airspeed dropped as the altimeters spun. At 10,000 feet, the pilots dropped their external tanks, silver cylinders tumbling into the sea below. The engines now ran clean, lean, and lethal. The climb continued 12,000, 15,000, 17,000 feet. Sunlight fractured off the twin booms as the formation broke through thin cirrus cloud. At 0933, Lieutenant Rex Barber looked left and saw movement. 2 specks approaching from the north, a mile higher, glittering in the sun. The lead aircraft was a long, cigar-shaped bomber, with rising black smoke from its exhausts. Behind it trailed a second bomber and 6 Zeros in loose escort. He toggled his gun switches on. The math had been perfect. At 0934, Mitchell ordered, "Tally-ho!" Over the radio, the first word spoken in 3 hours. The formation split in two. 4 killer P-38 seconds. Mitchell, Barber, Thomas Lanphier Jr., and Besby Holmes pulled into climbing turns toward the bombers, while the remaining 14 Lightnings climbed higher to hold off the escorts. Yamamoto's G4M Betty bomber, tail number T on a -323, flew exactly on schedule, 4,500 feet below the interceptors. In its cabin, the Admiral sat in full uniform, reading papers. The Japanese formation had no idea death was diving upon them at 360 miles per hour. Lanphier rolled his Lightning inverted and came down in a steep angle, firing short bursts. Barber came in from below and behind, his guns blazing. The concentrated streams of 50 caliber fire and 20 mm cannon shells tore through the Betty's right engine and wing root. The bomber caught fire instantly, trailing black smoke across the jungle canopy. A second later, it rolled onto its back and plunged into the trees near the mouth of the Moila River. The crash sent up a column of flame hundreds of feet high. Ugaki's second bomber, T on a -326, dove toward the coast, chased by Holmes and Hine. Holmes's guns jammed after his first burst. Hine pressed the attack but was driven off by Zeros. Ugaki's crew escaped with damage, crash landing at Bougainville's southern tip. Within minutes, the sky over southern Bougainville was a maelstrom of contrails and gunfire. The escorting Zeros dove on the American formation, but the P-38 seconds' superior speed and climb kept them out of reach. "Keep your power up," Mitchell barked. "Don't turn climb." The Lightnings rose like silver phantoms into the clouds. At 0943, the air was empty again. The Japanese escorts searched frantically for the attackers, finding only drifting smoke. They reported Yamamoto's aircraft missing minutes later. When search planes arrived that afternoon, they found the wreckage still burning. Yamamoto's body lay beside the wing, thrown clear of the fuselage, his white gloves unmarked, a sword still in his hand. His watch had stopped at 0934. Back at Guadalcanal, the P-38 seconds returned one by one. Only Lieutenant Raymond Hine failed to come home, likely lost at sea after being hit during the retreat. The surviving pilots landed after nearly 6 hours in the air fuel gauges near empty, faces grey from exhaustion. They were met by silence. The mission's success was immediately classified. The pilots were ordered to tell no one, not even each other, whom they had killed. Officially, a staff officer told them, "You intercepted a routine patrol." But among themselves they understood. The climb they had made that morning was more than an ambush. It was the moment when calculation, engineering, and endurance converged into history. The Japanese 204th Air Group's war diary recorded the event with stark simplicity. 0800 Admiral Yamamoto departed Rabaul. 0945 Communication lost 1030. No contact 1100. Smoke sighted near Bougainville 1130. Confirmation Admiral dead. The pilots who had once laughed at America's flying brick now flew morning patrols over the jungle, scanning the burned wreck. The fighter they had dismissed as clumsy had crossed an ocean, outclimbed their escorts, and rewritten the balance of the air war in a single, perfect parabola of mathematics and vengeance. In the end, the P-38 seconds climbed not just into altitude, but into legend. The Lightnings returned to Guadalcanal just after noon, their props feathering down one by one in the equatorial heat. Crews ran to meet them, clapping the wings and shouting questions none of which could be answered. Major John Mitchell's order was ironclad. No word of the target, not to anyone. Officially, it had been a long-range patrol with unconfirmed contacts. Unofficially, every man on the field sensed that something enormous had happened. The 339th pilots climbed stiffly from their cockpits, salt crusted on their flight suits, eyes bloodshot from the glare of 6 hours over water. One of them, Lieutenant Rex Barber, still trembled from adrenaline. His log entry that afternoon was terse. Fired on two-engine enemy bomber. Observed right engine smoking. Aircraft crashed in jungle. Time 0934. The mission's secrecy was absolute. The intelligence officers who had delivered the decrypted message of Yamamoto's itinerary had marked it top secret ultra. To preserve the cover, even the press communiques issued days later claimed that U.S. Army Air Forces intercepted enemy aircraft over Bougainville by chance. The truth was known to fewer than 50 men in the world. In the days that followed, the pilots were questioned individually by 13 Fighter Command. Major Mitchell's debriefing room was a small hut built from coconut logs and corrugated tin. Each pilot was handed a map and asked to mark his position at the moment of engagement. The accounts overlapped but differed in crucial details: angles of attack, burst lengths, the bomber's final moments. Lanphier, confident and articulate, insisted he had fired the fatal burst from a head-on pass. Barber, quieter and methodical, claimed the kill from below and behind. Both reports were plausible. The wreck was deep in jungle and could not be immediately examined. In the absence of proof, the Air Force did what bureaucracies often do. It shared credit. The official record listed both pilots as co-credited with Yamamoto's shootdown, but among their peers, the debate smouldered for decades. Mitchell, exhausted but calm, filed his after-action report with precision. 18 P-38Gs, 1 lost, Lieutenant Hine, missing in action, mission completed, probable destruction of 2 twin-engine enemy aircraft. When he signed the bottom of the page, he added a small note in pencil: Operation succeeded as planned. Target believed destroyed at 0934. At Rabaul, confirmation came with bitter finality. Search teams from the 204th Air Group hacked through Bougainville's jungle until they found the wreckage. The Betty bomber lay in 2 sections, its port wing burned away, its fuselage broken among the trees. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's body had been thrown clear of the cockpit. According to Japanese witnesses, his face was serene, as if asleep. A sword rested across his knees. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who survived in the second bomber, recorded the discovery in his diary. "We found the commander-in-chief seated as if still giving orders, his body unmarked except for a single wound to the head. His watch stopped at 0934. We buried him with full honours beneath the palms. I have lost not only a superior, but a father. The Japanese High Command kept the death secret for nearly 2 weeks. They feared the impact on national morale. When the announcement finally came on May 21, Tokyo radio spoke of an honorable death in battle against the enemy. Few in the Imperial Navy doubted the truth, but none dared speak it aloud. The Americans had somehow known Yamamoto's exact flight path, time, and altitude. At Guadalcanal, the Lightnings of the 339th returned to routine missions, escort flights, reconnaissance, and patrols over the slot. Yet something in their demeanor had changed. They had executed the most precise intercept in history, a mission measured not in miles but in seconds. It had proven the worth of the airplane that everyone, even their own allies, had once doubted. The flying brick had flown 870 miles round trip, skimmed the ocean undetected, climbed like a rocket into combat, and delivered a perfect strike. The P-38's detractors had argued that its weight and complexity made it unsuitable for the Pacific. The men of the 339th had just disproved that with mathematics and courage. The Air Force engineers, studying the fuel records afterward, realized how close the margin had been. Most of the Lightnings landed with less than 30 gallons, remaining barely 5 minutes of flight time. Barber's aircraft had run dry on final approach, coasting the last 100 yards. "That's cutting it fine," one mechanic muttered. "Yeah," Barber replied, but the math worked. Across the Pacific, the Japanese air groups that had once mocked the Lightning began to reassess. Interrogation reports captured after the war revealed entries from the 4th Air Group's diary. Enemy twin-engine fighter climbed with astonishing speed. Impossible to evade. Out of sun, attacked our leader's plane, destroyed in one burst. New tactic: vertical engagement. Avoid whenever possible. The term flying brick vanished from the diaries after that April. The tone turned grim. By May 1943, the Americans controlled the skies over the Solomons. The P-38 seconds of the 339th, 80th, and 44th Squadrons now roamed at will, using altitude and range to dominate the vast oceanic battlespace. Japanese pilots began to call the Lightning by a new name, Nitai no Oni, the twin-tailed devil. When word of Yamamoto's death finally reached the pilots of the 339th officially, it came in the form of a brief message from Halsey's headquarters. The mission of April 18 achieved its objective. Congratulations to all personnel involved. The enemy has been deprived of a great leader. Keep them flying. No ceremony followed, no medals yet awarded. The men went back to their tents, cleaned their guns, and checked their maps for the next day's flight. But among themselves, they knew what they had done. They had flown a mission drawn by hand on a map, powered by arithmetic and vengeance, and somewhere in the steaming jungles of Bougainville, the wreckage of a G-4M bomber cooled in the shade, proof that even a flying brick could rewrite history when the math was right. The shock of Yamamoto's death rippled across the Pacific like the aftershock of an earthquake. For the Americans, it was a vindication, the long arm of retribution reaching across an ocean. For the Japanese, it was the extinguishing of their guiding light. Yamamoto had been more than a commander. He was a symbol of intellect and modernity within an empire dominated by warriors and tradition. When his G-4M, Betty, failed to return to Rabaul on the 18th of April 1943, the Imperial Navy lost not only its leader, but its confidence. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, senior officers gathered in silence as Vice Admiral Ugaki relayed the details. The words, "enemy twin-engine fighters," echoed through the room. They all knew what that meant. The Americans' ungainly P-38 Lightnings, once dismissed as heavy curiosities, had executed a perfect ambush. The flying bricks had somehow crossed more than 400 miles of ocean, climbed into position, and annihilated their most guarded VIP flight. The initial disbelief soon turned to fury. Japanese intelligence officers searched frantically for an explanation. They interrogated radar operators, radio personnel, and every member of Yamamoto's staff. How had the Americans known? Some suspected betrayal, others whispered of divine punishment. A few officers, reading captured American reports, began to suspect the truth that their codes had been broken. But no one dared to suggest it aloud. Admitting such a breach would have meant dismantling the entire communications system of the Japanese Navy at the height of war. Instead, Tokyo broadcast a sanitized version of the story. On the 21st of May 1943, the Japanese public learned that Admiral Yamamoto had died in battle leading his forces against the enemy in the Solomons. He was posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral of the fleet. His ashes, carried aboard the battleship Musashi, returned to Japan in a solemn state funeral at Tokyo's Hibiya Park. Thousands of sailors and civilians bowed as his urn passed, the nation's grief carefully choreographed. But among the high command, grief was mixed with fear. The Americans had proven they could strike anywhere, even against the beating heart of the Imperial Navy. While Tokyo mourned, the 339th Fighter Squadron continued its war. The mission that had killed Yamamoto remained classified, but its lessons were not. Pilots from other squadrons visited the 339th to study their navigation methods, the way they had managed fuel, plotted intercept geometry, and used the P-38's climb to maximum advantage. Operation Vengeance became an unofficial textbook on long-range precision interception. The Lightning's reputation, once uncertain, soared overnight. The flying brick had revealed itself to be a thoroughbred. Lockheed's engineers back home received the after-action reports with fascination. Their calculations for turbo-supercharger efficiency at sea level had been theoretical. Now they had combat proof. A twin-engine fighter, they realized, could perform tasks. No single-engine plane could survive long-range escort, deep reconnaissance, and interception far beyond the reach of conventional air cover. American mechanics on Guadalcanal began painting small red circles beneath the nose art of each Lightning, marking confirmed kills. By summer, several pilots of the 339th Barber, Lanphier, and others had turned the twin-tailed plane into a symbol of technological dominance. The Japanese, whose fighters still relied on speed and agility rather than armor or power, now faced an opponent they could not easily outfly or outclimb. In Rabaul, the psychological damage was irreparable. Captured diaries from the 204th Air Group describe a creeping despair. One pilot wrote in late June, "We used to joke about the twin-engine American fighter, how slow it turned. Now we fear it. It climbs like a hawk, dives like a falling star, and its guns strike from far beyond our reach." The surviving Zeros of the 204th began avoiding high-altitude combat altogether. When American bombers appeared, Japanese escorts often waited low, hoping to catch stragglers. But the P-38 seconds changed the equation. Their turbo-superchargers gave them power above 25,000 feet, where the Mitsubishi A6M's engine gasped for air. For the first time in the Pacific, American fighters could dictate altitude and engagement. It was a subtle but decisive shift. The mathematics of climb and power, so patiently learned by the 339th, were now rewriting the very structure of the air war. By July 1943, Operation Cartwheel, the Allied drive to isolate Rabaul, was underway. P-38 seconds from the 18th and 347th Fighter Groups spearheaded long-range sweeps over New Britain and New Ireland. Their missions carried echoes of vengeance, low-level ingress, pinpoint timing, sudden climbs into interception. Even Japanese commanders began acknowledging the inevitable. One post-war interrogation of Captain Saburo Sakai recorded his admission, "When the twin-tailed fighters appeared, our hearts sank. We knew then the Americans had found the formula. They no longer fought for maneuver, they fought with mathematics. The Japanese tried countering with new aircraft the Ki-61 Tony, the radial engine Ki-84 Frank, and upgraded Zero models, but fuel. Shortages and declining pilot training eroded their impact. The P-38 seconds, meanwhile, grew faster and deadlier with each new variant. The legend of the flying brick had come full circle. What began as ridicule in January 1943 had become terror by autumn. The aircraft that Yamamoto's bodyguards had scorned was now the weapon that haunted their skies. And though the mission remained secret, word spread through the Pacific like a whisper. The Americans had avenged Pearl Harbor. In September 1943, a captured Japanese document summarized the change with bureaucratic simplicity. Enemy twin-engine fighter, type unknown, possibly P-38, possesses superior climb and diving speed, capable of long-range interception. Engagement should be avoided unless in numbers or surprise advantageous. Those lines, typed by an intelligence officer in Rabaul, marked the death of another legend, the myth of Japanese air superiority. The flying brick had broken it. By the end of 1943, the legend of the P-38 Lightning had become inseparable from the story of Operation Vengeance. What had begun as an act of revenge had quietly evolved into a blueprint for a new kind of air warfare, one defined by altitude, range, and precision, rather than pure dogfighting skill. The flying brick that had once been mocked for its size and stiffness now served as the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Force's strategic reach in the Pacific. At 13 Fighter Command Headquarters on Guadalcanal, the air war was no longer about holding an island. It was about dismantling the enemy's logistics, fuel dumps, shipping lanes, and forward bases from thousands of feet above. Every mission flown after April 18 carried the signature of vengeance: long-range ingress, low-level approach, exact timing, and a climb to superiority. Even new pilots arriving from stateside training were taught the Bougainville method, named after the intercept that killed Yamamoto. In October, Major John Mitchell was transferred to staff duty at 13 Fighter Command, where he was tasked with rewriting the fighter operations manual for the entire South Pacific area. His report, later archived in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, opened with a simple premise: the P-38 is not to be flown like a pursuit aircraft, it is to be flown like artillery with wings. Mitchell's recommendations codified everything the 339th had discovered through trial and blood. Fighters would operate in pairs or fours, using altitude advantage instead of horizontal maneuver. Engagements should begin from at least 10,000 feet above the target. Climbing and diving. Attacks boom and zoom would replace the traditional turning fight. Within months, this doctrine spread across the Pacific. At New Guinea, Colonel Charles Lindbergh, serving as a civilian consultant, observed 475th Fighter Group missions and noted the Lightning's unmatched endurance. His field notes from Nadzab in November 1943 recorded, "At economy mixture, 1,500 miles range achievable. Turbo-superchargers function efficiently at 28,000 feet. The Japanese cannot follow." By late 1943, Japanese intelligence had fully recognized the implications. The captured 4th Air Group War Diary, later translated by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, summarized the shift with grudging respect. Enemy twin-engine fighter, formerly underestimated, now supreme above 25,000 feet. Superior in climb, dive, and fire endurance. Avoid protracted combat. Strike from surprise or disengage immediately. It was a confession that Japan's tactical edge had evaporated. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, could no longer control the sky. Its light structure, so perfect for the short, agile duels of 1942, was a death sentence in the heavy, high-altitude brawls of 1943. The P-38 could absorb hits that shredded Zeros to dust. More importantly, it could fight where the Zeros couldn't breathe. Even the Japanese pilots began to feel the futility. In a post-war interrogation, Lieutenant Toshio Ichimaru of the 204th Air Group recalled, "We climbed after them until our engines shook and power faded. The twin-tailed fighters simply rose away. They waited above, then fell like stones. You could not outturn them because they would not turn. You could not outrun them because they were already there." The laughter that had greeted the first sight of the flying bricks over Rabaul was gone. In its place was a kind of resigned awe. Back at Lockheed's Burbank factory, the reports from the South Pacific became design instructions. Engineers refined intercoolers, modified leading-edge radiators, and strengthened the compressibility recovery system that had cost so many lives early on. The P-38J introduced enlarged chin intakes and a full-time dive flap system solving Finally, the deadly control lock that had haunted the early models. Pilots flying the new variants in late 1943 were astonished. They could now push past 500 miles per hour in a dive and pull out cleanly. The same aircraft that had once been dangerous to its own pilots now gave them confidence at every altitude. Captain Thomas Lanphier, whose name was forever tied to Yamamoto's death, summed up the transformation in a letter home. "We used to fight the airplane, now it fights for us. You can feel the engineering in your hands, every pound of thrust, every foot of climb. You point the nose, and the war goes that way." The United States had turned technology itself into a weapon. By December 1943, P-38 seconds were flying from every Allied airfield between New Guinea and the Gilberts. Their missions blurred the line between fighter and bomber escort, interception, ground attack, reconnaissance, all executed with the same calculated precision. The mathematics of climb had become a system of warfare. At the same time, 13 fighter command analysts began to quantify results. Monthly summaries showed that Lightning units had achieved a 5-2-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft since April. Even more significant were the bomber escort losses, cut by half compared to operations before the P-38's arrival. The once derided twin-engine fighter had become the statistical foundation of air superiority. The Japanese understood what that meant. In December, an entry from the Imperial Navy Air Staff summarized the situation with bureaucratic finality. Enemy twin-engine fighter cannot be countered at altitude. Introduction of new aircraft, Raiden, Shiden, insufficient. Present strategy untenable. In the skies over the Pacific, the contest was no longer even. The flying brick had transcended mockery, revenge, and even legend. It had become doctrine proof that America's blend of engineering and arithmetic could turn ridicule into dominance. By the time 1943 ended, the P-38 was no longer the strange twin-boom fighter nobody understood. It was the shape of victory itself, a machine that had climbed, both literally and symbolically, above every enemy it faced. By early 1944, the sky over the South Pacific had changed color. What had once been streaked with the rising arcs of Zeros and Betty bombers was now dominated by the metallic glint of American aluminum. The Lightning had done what no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy had believed possible. It had made altitude an American possession. From Bougainville to Truk, from New Britain to the Marshalls, Japanese pilots looked upward and saw death outlined in twin silver booms. The first half of 1944 was the reckoning. For the Imperial Navy Air Service, still reeling from Yamamoto's loss, the P-38 problem had become a strategic crisis. The Navy's fighter wings, once the pride of the Empire, were being outflown, outgunned, and outclimbed by a machine they had ridiculed as an airborne ox cart. In January, the 4th Air Group Diary, one of the few surviving operational records, recorded a grim observation. "The Americans do not fight in circles anymore. They come down like hammers from heaven. The sound of their guns is continuous, like tearing metal. Our planes vanish in pieces." That hammer from heaven was now being forged in volume that defied comprehension. Lockheed's Burbank plant produced a P-38 every 90 minutes. Evansville's Allison division shipped engines faster than the Japanese could replace lost pilots. Each Lightning that rolled from the line was a machine of calculated supremacy, turbo-superchargers, breathing thin stratospheric air, 800 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, and tanks that gave it the range of a bomber. In February 1944, the 475th Fighter Group carried the doctrine of vengeance north into New Guinea and beyond. Their target was Wewak, Japan's major forward airbase and a critical artery to Rabaul. The mission profile was pure Lightning arithmetic: climb to 25,000 feet, dive through the thin tropical haze, and strike before the enemy could scramble. At dawn on February 3, 48 P-38 seconds swept across the Bismarck Sea. Within minutes, they had cut through layers of circling Zeros, shredding them with 8-gun salvos that traced perfect geometric intersections through the sky. Japanese ground observers reported enemy fighters descending from the sun with unstoppable velocity. When the smoke cleared, 34 Japanese aircraft burned on the runways. and not a single Lightning was lost. American gun camera film from that day, now preserved in the National Archives, shows something elemental: precision replacing chaos. The Lightning pilots no longer chased opponents through turning duels. They fired from planned convergence points calculated in altitude, speed, and distance. War had become mathematics with wings. Japanese pilots began referring to the P-38 seconds as Kaminari Oni Thunder Demons. In the post-war interrogations conducted by the Allied translator and interpreter section, 1-0 pilot from the 204th Air Group recalled, "They could be above us, below us, or behind us within seconds. Their speed made the sky feel smaller. We felt like insects under glass." The collapse of experience compounded the disaster. With veteran flyers dead or exhausted, replacements arrived with barely 150 hours of total flight time, half of what an American pilot logged before even reaching combat. The Lightning pilots, by contrast, were now masters of their trade. Men like Charles MacDonald, Thomas Lanphier, and Dick Bong had turned the twin-engine fighter into a symbol of inevitability. In March 1944, 13 Fighter Command intelligence tallied the results. P-38 units claimed 1,487 aerial victories in the previous 6 months, at a cost of just 131 aircraft lost to enemy action. The kill ratio was approaching 11-1. The numbers told a story no propaganda could disguise. The Empire's air arm was dying in arithmetic defeat. Strategically, the Lightning extended American power beyond geography. Its range transformed the Pacific from an obstacle into a highway. In April, long-range P-38J models launched from bases in the Admiralties escorted bombers deep into the Caroline Islands, striking Truk, Palau, and the Marshalls in rapid succession. For the first time, Japanese fleet movements could no longer hide beyond reach. To the Japanese defenders, the new pattern was terrifying. Radar screens would light with approaching formations at 25,000 feet too high for their interceptors to reach before fuel exhaustion. Moments later, they would descend in coordinated waves, shattering airfields, transports, and morale alike. Captain Toshio Ota, in a letter recovered from a downed Zero, wrote simply, "We wait on the ground for the gods to strike. They are two-tailed and silver." Back on Guadalcanal, the veterans of the 339th read the after-action reports from WEWAC and smiled quietly. They saw in those missions the same geometry, the same calm precision that had guided them to Bougainville the year before. Vengeance had become strategy. The death of one admiral had transformed the entire American approach to air war. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, visiting from the European theatre, toured the South Pacific that spring and observed the Lightning in action. His report to the air staff summarized what every Japanese pilot had already learned. The P-38 is not a fighter in the old sense. It is an altitude weapon. It commands the vertical. Whoever commands the vertical commands the war. By June 1944, the Lightnings were everywhere: New Guinea, Biak, the Marianas. The Pacific was shrinking under their contrails. The mockery that had once greeted them in Rabaul mess halls was forgotten, replaced by dread and silence. Even in Tokyo, intelligence briefings now included the phrase, "America no ryoiki koku," America's domain of the sky. The flying brick had climbed far beyond ridicule. It had climbed into legend, carrying with it the quiet vindication of every pilot who had once been told his aircraft could never dance. It didn't need to dance. It only needed to rise and, from there, to fall like thunder.